This is Radio Cairo, and it's 4 o'clock. Honor to have with us today His Excellency Ambassador Georg Pöstinger, the Ambassador of Austria in Cairo, a man who is a very distinguished diplomat who has a degree in law and history and art history from Vienna University and a master's degree also in law and art history, with a lot of studies in Paris and Rome, and serving his country in Sweden, Tokyo and Saudi Arabia for 11 years, 6 of them as the DCM and 5 years as the ambassador, and now a distinguished ambassador in Cairo. Sir, thank you very much for taking the time to come to our studio here, and really it's a great pleasure and honor.
Thank you. The honor is mine. I'm very happy to be with you in this coming hour and to have a nice chat with you.
Definitely, sir. It's a really great pleasure and honor to have the ambassador who's representing Austria and Vienna. And for our dear listeners, Austria is carrying a lot of dreams, and a lot of vivid memories. Even a lot of them didn't go there to Austria, but they have seen the movie, right? The sound of music.
Asmahan song.
Yes, that's what I'm going to say. Everybody mostly they have seen the sound of music and have seen the mountains and feel the music whenever they see this movie, and everybody loves the song of Asmahan, which she never sang for Paris or for London. She said the best nights, or Layali al-Uns fi Vienna. Exactly. That is the nights of happiness are in Vienna. And she keep on singing this beautiful valse, which is borrowed from Strauss most probably, and you can hear her sound going all through the radios for the past 70 or 80 years. So this is what the people know about Vienna. But what they might not be knowing is that Austria, formerly the Republic of Austria, is a landlocked country in Central Europe, lying in the Eastern Alps. And Austria is bordered by Germany to the northwest, Czech Republic to the north, Slovakia to the northeast, Hungary to the east, Slovenia and Italy to the south, Switzerland and Liechtenstein to the west. This makes it a very busy country geographically, right? I mean, it's surrounded by all European countries. So the question that we always ask, was geography a blessing or a problem to Austria?
That's a good question. And I think, fortunately, we cannot define where we are located, geographically speaking.
Yes.
And then I think it depends on which angle you look at this question. If you look back, of course, or you look at our country on the map, we are indeed in the heart of Europe, which means that pretty much everyone throughout history, over thousands of years, hundreds of years, came through and left something. Mm-hmm. So it is at the crossroads in Europe. And I believe by looking at our cultural heritage, I think it was a blessing. Mm-hmm. It was a blessing because, something new is always created out of opposites. Mm-hmm. And if opposites meet, there's a kind of very fruitful outcome in general. Whether it is in literature, it is in politics, it's in diplomacy, it is in music, which we probably will also touch upon a bit later.
Yes, we have.
So this is indeed, I think, a very positive aspect that we are in the center of Europe. Now, the countries you mentioned, of course, some of them used to be
inside the borders of the empire.
Exactly,
yes.
Exactly.
I mean, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Austrians were the dominant part. The Austrian part was the dominant part. Yes, there was a queen, there was a king, but definitely it was an Austro-Hungarian, not Hungarian-Austrian empire. and it was a strong empire, and we'll touch that on it. But let's stay to geography. I mean, you were having a lot of countries near you, and you have definitely affected these countries, right? And being affected by them as well.
Of course, it is a mutual. How should I say? I mean, you deal with your neighbors. At the same time, I think our neighbors are perhaps even closer to us because of our common history than in other cases, I dare say. Yes, we had this common empire for hundreds of years, which was forged throughout a very long time. Yes, we split away from each other after World War I. And yet there is a very strong influence in both directions. And I mean, let me just mention during the Cold War, when the Iron Curtain passed just at our border to the eastern side, I think that was the saddest time for my own country, because there was no exchange with the countries we used to have an exchange with and who used to be one with us.
Exactly.
And this changed entirely in 1990 when the Iron Curtain fell. And we could see this revival of exchanges and people suddenly coming back and forth and again took up, so to say, so many of interesting aspects, which unite us also in a certain way.
It's a good example of European Union, because when I traveled to Austria, sometimes even when I was having a scholarship in Switzerland and looking through the borders, they look very much artificial between European countries, because nowadays, after these borders have been removed, you can hardly feel any difference between any country and the other. You can find any difference between Switzerland and Austria, or Switzerland and Germany, or Austria and Germany. When the borders have been removed, it's the same background. I mean, the same mountains, the same nature, and almost the same people, right?
Exactly.
So that's what I felt. I mean, when going, for example, from Budapest to Vienna,
right,
there is nothing you cannot feel the difference.
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, what you just mentioned, I couldn't agree more to it. I think that the European Union of today, how we live it, had its precursor somehow at a smaller scale up to 1914 and 18.
Yes. That's what we're going to talk about, yes, because Austria was the heartland of the Habsburg monarchy since the late 13th century, and it's one of the oldest dynasties, continuous dynasty. I mean, they went on governing Austria, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, from the 13th century up till the 20th century. It was a major imperial power in the Central Europe for centuries, and from the 16th century, Vienna was also serving as the Holy Roman Empire administrative capital, because this was the remnants of the Charlemagne Empire. Because when the Germany and France, or the Prussians and the French, had their wars in between each other, originally they were brothers in arms, because they were members of the Charlemagne Empire. This makes them very what binds them, or what unites them, is more than what divides them. In spite, for example, the 4 different wars that went, whether this Napoleonic or 1870 or 1914 or 1939, all this is something that is totally new, because they stayed united for more years prior to that. So, before the dissolution of the empire 2 years later, in 1804, Austria suddenly emerged again, and this was in the peak of the Napoleonic Wars, and established its own empire, which became a great power and one of the largest states in Europe. So what are the reasons for being a large state, and unfortunately the decline that happened later on?
I mean, you mentioned the dynasties. Actually, we had 2 dynasties. The Habsburg, as you rightly said, from the 13th century onwards. Before, there was another dynasty, but I mean, let's say in the course of about 1,000 years, there were only 2 dynasties, which what we deduct from it is that there was a stability. So the stability of the leadership in modern terms now, if I may say so, in the country, that was one thing. Now, you mentioned the Holy Roman Empire and Habsburg's involvement, because since the 15th century, basically, it's the 16th century, they were exclusively Habsburgs at the head of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, it is actually, I think, the change that happened, as you also rightly mentioned, with in the framework of the Napoleonic Wars, the beginning of the 19th century, that the last emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Francis I, abdicated as emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And a couple of years later, in the larger framework of the Napoleonic Wars, we could restart with the Congress of Vienna, which was, of course, the reshaping of Europe at that time. And with it comes, of course, Metternich as the Chancellor and absolute right hand of the Emperor, who dominated out of alliances that were shaped prior to it with Russia, Prussia, Great Britain at that time, and then later France joined again into it. So these were the dominant powers in Europe, and tried to continue the stability with what they called at that time the European concert. So let's see that you always are in exchange, and you make sure that stability is given within those 5 pillars.
So Metternich is considered to be one of the godfathers, right, more or less, and he was definitely the role model of Kissinger later on.
Well, he
wrote
his PhD on it.
Yes, he wrote his PhD about him, and he considered him to. I mean, the motto that Metternich used to say, the best thing is to have no peace, no war. This would make things very good. But if you have peace or war, the peace will going always to bring war, and the war will bring peace, and it goes on viciously.
Yes.
So do you think Metternich is one of the pillars of the stability, in spite of being a great follower of Machiavelli?
Well, Machiavelli also says a lot of things that
Yes.
are probably valid up to now.
Yes, unfortunately, yes.
Unfortunately, right?
Yes. He was on the personal life, he was an ideal man, but on the book, he looks to be like a real opportunistic, right?
You're absolutely right. Well, I think you always have to look at it in the context of the time. And at the time, Metternich was probably the person who could forge this kind of stability that lasted for several decades at least. And therefore, he might have been, or I'm pretty much sure that he was the right person at the time. I mean, now, of course, judging from nowadays, looking back in history,
Perspective, yes.
you find, of course, here and there difficulties, and you would question certain things. But I mean, the emperor at that time had 100% trust in Metternich, and was sure that he can assure the stability, and left him completely free hand, which also was, I mean, very rare at that time, where the monarch still had a very strong hand, usually in all the different dossiers. But here, when it came to foreign politics, the emperor left it to Metternich. Metternich, who was then also interesting to look at, because he came in with the Congress of Vienna, and he left only in 1848, when he was not the last emperor of Austria-Hungary, but the one before, came into power. So he somehow he bridges the time of the Napoleonic Wars up to the mid 19th century. And then we go already into the last 50 years of the existence of the empire.
So in the last 50 years of the 19th century, there were we can use the expression, the seeds of decline embedded in this glory that was happening. I mean, there was an emperor, and he was a long-lived emperor, and his wife was the favorite of, for example, of the Hungarians, and Elizabeth was considered always to be their like their godmother or something like that.
Right.
They having her statue in Budapest, and they really cherish her and consider her to be their queen or their emperor. But the king stayed for a long time. Do you think that this is a reason of the survival of this particular emperor was the reason of the fall?
Certainly.
I mean, he lost one of his archdukes for suicide, and then later on
his only son.
His only son. Yes.
I mean, again, of course, it has to be put into the context of the time. I mean, just let me give you a few words on what the situation was before we turn to Franz Joseph as such. Economically, it was a big boom. So especially the 70s, then followed by a short economic recession, but then again at around 1900 it was a big economic boost in the entire empire.
They say that from 1900 to 1914 Europe has never seen such great grandeur and greatness and splendor like these 14 golden years, right?
Right. And this was actually set on this kind of very solid economic life we had at that time, and of course it triggered in terms of culture what we all know about Vienna around 1900. What was permanently present as well was, of course, nationalism and the concept of the nation state, and this is something which to a certain extent didn't really go along with the concept the emperor at that time, Franz Joseph, came out of, because I mean he was born in 1830, so we have a completely different environment. He still was educated, so to say, in the spirit of the 18th century, and probably was not ready anymore to adapt to the concept of nation states as such as we know it in the modern terms. So the nation state finally, I think, was, besides the non-understanding of these movements by the emperor, who, as I said before, came out from a different concept, a concept that was forged in the Middle Ages, that the monarchy is the monarch, but not necessarily a country, you know, with one border, with one people, with etc. So this is the medieval concept of monarchy.
Like what Louis XIV used to say.
Exactly.
I'm the state and the state is me.
Correct. And this was incompatible with this new idea of having your own nation state, everyone speaks the same language, etc. Right, I think this is certainly the ingredients for a political decline, and then we know what happened after 1914, that led to the end of the empire finally.
In 1914, they always say that the accident of the murder of or the assassination of Franz Joseph, the Archduke of Austria, and his wife in Bosnia. This is definitely the sort of the cause of the war. Do you think so? Or I mean, was it really the going to the war was inevitable? I mean, it was a cascade of events, but
exactly,
it could have been stopped.
I think very difficultly. I mean, there was a big rate. I mean, if you look at the documents of the time, you can feel how powerful each single nation thought it would be. I mean, nations outside or surrounding the empire, and everyone was actually ready to go to war. There was this strong will of going to the battlefield, which is sometimes, especially in a region that suffers also with current wars, you don't understand how can you want this, basically. So I think it was from this point of view, but also from the point of view of dependencies in terms of alliances, it was inevitable, unfortunately. I mean, I and again, it's always easier to judge from nowadays, looking backwards. Once you are embedded in your context, which was 1914, and rationally looked at things. I mean, your crown prince is assassinated. So what are you going to do?
Yeah.
Do you say, well, it doesn't matter, let's go over to normal? And this was one thing. I mean, we know that the emperor himself was very hesitant to go into war. Very hesitant. And yet, decisions probably also by advisors, etc., were taken too quickly in order to lead to what we know.
Yes, I mean the joining of the Germans. I mean, they always say that if Franz Joseph was not that old, and if William II, or however they pronounce it, the Kaiser of Germany, was not that bold and not that intelligent, things would have changed. History would have had another turn. They say so. I mean, and if the Ottomans were not that got into the trap to sign the treaty, maybe the Ottoman Empire would have survived for some years to go, because it's very hard to find the Ottoman Empire that was fighting to get control of Vienna 2 centuries, 3 centuries ago, or 2 centuries ago, before that, and then you find them signing a treaty. And the prime minister who was signing the treaty was an Egyptian man, you know that, of course. I mean, Said Halim, and he found himself, he was opposing this. I mean, I was just reading this the other day. Said Halim, who was the son of Prince Muhammad Abdul Halim, the youngest of Muhammad Ali's family. Yes. So he was the grandson of Muhammad Ali, the direct grandson of Muhammad Ali, and his father has been sent for exile into Istanbul. and because he lost his demand, he could not be given the throne because of the law. So he was chased to Istanbul. He took his younger son there, and his young son served into the government, suddenly got a promotion to become a foreign minister, and then a prime minister and a foreign minister, signing two things that sealed his fate.
Yeah.
The first thing was to sign the treaty with the Austrians and the Germans to become allied together and pulling the Ottoman Empire into the rubbles. And the second is to sign the decree for in 1915, 1916 for the sending off or the disembarkment of the Armenians, and therefore causing the Armenian genocide. Later on he sealed his fate because he was murdered or assassinated back in Rome. So when you look at this cascade of events, you say, how can apparently intelligent people do all these grave mistakes?
Well, because of the
Arrogance.
framework of the time, I think. I mean, you're absolutely right. In theory, you're right. I mean, if Francis Joseph had
The will of a young man.
over at an earlier stage,
Yes.
also perhaps had listened more to the advices of his crown prince. Because I mean, also with his son, he had big issues. The one who committed suicide, unfortunately, who was a very liberal, very open-minded character, very much rooted also in literature and.
Is it just related to romance? That's why he shot himself, or it was related to the pressure that his.
Most probably, it must have been the pressure, actually. And he had a difficult relationship with his father, who was, kind of this, as I said before, in a mindset that is from the outgoing 18th century still, and who managed to re-establish also internal order after the revolution of 48, and so on and so forth. So he was not really listening to what his son was saying, but so he was not to his crown prince, the successor of his son who committed suicide, who also had quite a lot of modern ideas to introduce.
So the Archduke was a modern man and liberal man.
He was less liberal than the son of the emperor.
He was his nephew, right?
Exactly, he was his nephew. But of course, he introduced the new generations, and this was a big difference. I mean, nowadays, if you look at modern monarchies in Europe, who witness kings that step down and hand over to their sons or to their daughters to take up, so to say, the power. This was a no-go at that time. But I agree, if Franz Joseph had handed over earlier, and perhaps there would have been a little bit less, had there had been a bit less of push from the German side,
Yes.
one could have avoided it, yes.
It's really amazing, and I mean, the mistakes that were done on the day of assassination, when the Archduke insisted on going and seeing in the hospital how was the company of his who got injured in the first assassination assault, which was with the grenade, and then he went again in the same street to meet his fate with the other guy who was standing. I mean, this is really
fate, as you
it's
say.
fate.
It's
It's really fate that has sealed the fate of millions of people who just lost their lives.
But let me come back to the dismantlement quickly in 1918. I mean, still the spirit at that time in Europe and the major powers in Europe, which we used to be one of them, were not ready to give up the
to reconcile,
empire. With one exception, it was. I'm very sorry to say that, but it's a country that's very close to me. It was France. It was the president Clemenceau. Sorry, Clemenceau, who was very much behind the dismantlement of the empire.
Yes.
UK was not. Russia was not.
But actually, what's written about this particular part is that Clemenceau and Lloyd George were too much imperialistic. Clemenceau, by the way, was a physician by education, and he immigrated to the States for some time. I mean, it's a very bizarre career, and then came back to seal the fate of the whole of the world. And so Clemenceau and Lloyd George, and then Woodrow Wilson come as a victorious man, receiving the victory parades, and he says everything is going to put in place, and we are not going to do all these bizarre movements and these imperial movements. We're not going to put Germany to kneel on its knees. And then he got the COVID, or the Spanish flu, and he's completely mixed up. I mean, his character has changed. He had a minor stroke in the beginning,
and the idea of divided impera came in.
Yes, and then he submitted to Lloyd George and Clemenceau.
Yeah.
This was really another hand of fate. I mean, Clemenceau, nobody should have depended on Clemenceau because he was on the failure side. He failed. I mean, if not for the Americans, they would have never won on this battle.
I mean, again, with distance, looked at history. Of course, there's a logic for the French position at that time.
Yes,
because,
they were victorious. Yes, they wanted the Lorraine, they wanted the Alsace, and they wanted to submit Germany.
Exactly, and moreover, I mean, a powerful Austria was considered being a natural ally of Germany because of our common language, etc.
Of course,
and hence being of major danger for France as such. So, history. I mean, there is a logic, of course, and then there is some other, as you just mentioned before, factors that come in and turn everything upside down, and we have a completely different outcome.
It really affected, for example, Egypt, because Saad Zaghloul went there and he had no listening ears because Woodrow Wilson, with a lot of reservations about his character, was the only hope for bringing justice, if they use the expression, to the land of Versailles, and nobody gave justice on this particular day, and that's why things ended up very wrongfully in the Second World War. So it's definitely, when we look back, we find a lot of mistakes that were done in 1918, 1919.
Do we learn out of mistakes in history?
I don't think so. I don't think so, because really this is really very, very strange how things went on. I mean, everything went bad because therefore it was very easy for fascism to rise and Nazism to rise and the frustrations to build up.
Definitely.
And I think that the only thing that people learned was the hand of fate that led that de Gaulle was a prisoner of war for 3 years in Germany. And he learned German and he read Germans and he read history and he read the German literature. And that's why we have an enlightened French gentleman, better than Clemenceau, and we had an enlightened German leader, and
after World War II.
After World War II, of course, we're not talking about Hitler. We're talking about Adenauer. I mean, there's a big difference. Adenauer was a politician, and he was a man who has been harassed and put to jail and has seen the fascism and Nazism and the true picture of it. He just escaped by a hand of fate.
Very true.
So these two gentlemen have helped to shape Europe. I know that we will leave 1914-18 and we'll leave the World War II, but we'll go to a very important, crucial part, which is the Russians or the Soviets were inside Austria, and it's the only country that they withdrew from. And how was it able? How things went out to Austria nicely, because it's the only place that the Soviets accepted to withdraw from, and the Iron Curtain was drawn on the borders.
I think.
Where do you see? You see Truman, or you see de Gaulle, or you see who? Who do you see in the man
the
who?
situation in 45 was that both Germany and Austria were occupied by the Allies, right? So we had the Americans, we had the Soviets, we had the French, and the British. Now, Germany already, if I remember well, in 1949 was divided in East Germany and West Germany. There was no Berlin Wall, of course, at that time. But the zone of influence was very clearly defined, which did not happen in Austria. Then there was a so-called, for Austria, there was a so-called, in 1943 already, the Moscow Memorandum. And the Moscow Memorandum saw Austria as part of Nazi Germany, certainly, but also stated that Austria was the first victim, so to say, of the Nazi aggression, not denying Austria's participation in Nazi crime. This was very much present at that time also. So there was this differentiation that it was part of Nazi Germany, but it was not Nazi Germany at the same time, with responsibility, etc., etc. Actually, the negotiations did not take off very nicely at the beginning. And what made a big change was the passing of Stalin.
Stalin, yes, 1953, yes.
And with Khrushchev, an entirely different wind came in, the thorn, Khrushchev's thorn. I think it's also famous for this, which made it possible that negotiations were taken up, and then we brought in the concept of perpetual neutrality, which finally, now in a nutshell, it was of course a complicated negotiations, etc., and then there was a group that didn't want to have a perpetual neutrality, but said it is enough to not be part of a military alliance, but finally we went for the perpetual neutrality.
That's 1955.
This was in 1955.
The birth of this new state and new
Of
republic.
an independent Austria, that's correct, yes.
This is a fresh breeze that happened.
Absolutely.
I mean, 1 year later there was the crushing of Budapest in Hungary in October 1956.
And a few years later you had the same in
Czech Republic, yes, in Czechoslovakia, in Prague in 1968. So this is something that, I mean, another hand of fate. There are a lot of hands of fate we're talking about this day today. Yes, definitely.
So I think we are blessed.
Yes, maybe because you were the heart of the great Holy Roman Empire. Well, this is, I mean, of course our listeners are mixed up because of all this history, but this is how Austria has been formed, and how things have been going on with or against, and how the 20th century, especially the first 55 years, was very, or the first, I mean, from 1914 till 1955, this is what we can call harsh and hard years.
Oh, very much so.
Yes.
Not just because we had two wars, but also the period from 1918 to 38.
Yes.
Was very difficult, and
the Anschluss, which was in 1938,
exactly.
the annexing of Austria, and the pictures that they, I mean, all the historians would like always to put, showing some Austrians waving happily to the Nazi forces as they're going into Vienna, which is totally against what we read later on in history books. I mean, specialized history books would show that the Austrians did not like the idea. They didn't feel like that this union would bring them any goodness. But always they liked the first historians to put this picture of people clapping and welcoming, which is totally against.
It was many more than just a few who were waving, and I mean,
yes.
The pictures are, of course, they're telling the truth when Hitler came into Vienna,
yes.
etc. But again, we have to locate it in the context, and to be honest, and especially if you compare Austria of today. After 1918, no one, I swear to you, no one believed in Austria anymore, because, I mean, the empire was dismantled.
Mm-hmm.
There was no industry anymore, because the industry used to be then what became the Czechoslovakia.
Yes.
There was no hinterland to this extent. So each entity, more or less, became independent. Several parts, like the western Ukraine of today, was then Ukraine. We had, or a part went to Romania, etc., etc. So there was nothing left but the German-speaking part of Austria.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also why the first, just in brackets, by the first republic, we call it the first republic from 1918 to 1938, was called the Republic Deutsch-Österreich, so German-Austrian, but I mean it refers to the fact
language.
that we speak German language. But to come back to this situation that no one really believed in the viability of what remained, and Clemenceau was always quoted because he said, what the remainings, that's Austria. And this was also the same in the people. And there was, of course, throughout all parties, even the socialists at that time, thought the only anchor would be of stability would be to go together with Germany. Mm-hmm. So you have to understand that not only populism that was at its peak with Hitler, of course, and came in with him, but there was also a fertile ground. Mm-hmm. By just having doubts.
That's right. That's the frustration of 1918, 1919. Definitely, the real frustrations, because actually there was no real defeat on the field in Germany in the World War One. But it was the first country that submitted was Germany, and therefore they said you are the one who was defeated. So I think we've talked a lot of history. After the break, we'll talk more something nice things about Austria of today, which will bring a lot of nice memories and nice things to talk about. So you're still listening to Radio Cairo, and we're coming from Studio 3. Our distinguished guest today is His Excellency Ambassador Georg Pöstinger, the Ambassador of Austria in Cairo, and the talk will go on just after the break. So you're still listening to Radio Cairo. This is World of Info. My name is Dr. Amr Mabrouk. Dua Muhammad is still at the control, and we are having His Excellency, the distinguished Ambassador Georg Pöstinger, Ambassador of Austria to Cairo, and we're talking about the new republic or the state. Second Republic, yes. So Austria has been liberated in 1955. It became a state. It became a republic. It became a democratic republic, and it now consistently ranks high in the terms of GDP per capita due to its highly industrialized economy and well-developed social market economy. How was that possible? I mean, in 1955, things were a bit gloomy in the beginning because you were lacking some of the basic needs and industry and things like that. But as once I read that the people were there, the educated population, the population was which wanted to succeed, and they already had been prepared well. So it was not from scratch. The people were. I think the reason of success was the people.
Definitely, I think. I mean, the experience, of course, we went through World War II and the very difficult times between World War I and World War II was a lesson somehow to the people as such, especially also to politicians who at that time also all had a very high sense of responsibility, and it doesn't matter which ideology they were, whether they were socialists or Christian Democrats or liberals or whatever. So the sake to build up a new country was very much at the forefront. And then, of course, I mean, we got also some aid. We were one of those countries who benefited from the Marshall Plan.
Yes.
And the Marshall Plan was certainly triggering our wealth of today, now in a nutshell, so to say. I mean, we could build up a very good environment for business in general. We could build up a very comprehensive social system, which is still in place up to now. A very good level of education for the entire population. And still up to now, we have very low crime rates. So this all, so to say, is a fertile ground for building up wealth in general.
One of the good things about education is that there is something like we call in science or in animal kingdom, which is called the natural selection. So but this time the natural selection is made by the students, not by, of course, by authorities. With that, when a student finds himself not very much interested in higher school education, he will go for vocational training or schools, which is a system which is present in Switzerland and in Germany, which gives a lot of respect to the handy people who would like to work with their hands in different ways. So they can go for the school of plumbing or electricians or whatever, and if they find themselves the interest, there is also always a way back, that they can go back to the educational mainstream and join the university if they want. So they let them, it's not just one way direction. So what was the motive for it? Because when you give hope to people that go to vocational training, go to vocational education, if you don't feel like studying geography and biology and mathematics, but there is always the door is open to go back if at any time you want to become a white collar or something like that.
I mean, you just mentioned also another two countries, namely Switzerland and Germany. I mean, it is the Germanic-speaking countries which share this tradition, and I think it is again rooted, as everything, very much in history. So handcraft as such always had a very high value in our world of Germanic-speaking countries. 100 years back, and I think it just is based on this idea that it is something which is worth achieving. The mere fact also that you have this entrepreneurial thought that comes in, that because if you do this vocational training, you are also in a position to run a shop, so to say, and you get all the necessary how should I put it, requirements to run a business and a shop, which is very important because people are eager to establish their own business, which actually that's also a parallel with Egypt and the Arab world. I mean, I feel here that the individuum is very entrepreneurial thinking. And if you can build up a small business, and if it's just one person, why don't you do that? So this is the idea actually that came in and was fruitful for building up this kind of education, as you said. But you mentioned it as well. You can switch. So even if you finalize a vocational training, and you think that later on you would like to study mathematics, well, you still can do so. So this is a system that allows to everyone actually to find his or her way of
success
what the person wants to achieve, and at the same time can contribute finally to the country.
And things we are talking about the freedom of choice of the students to find their own way with all due respect. There's something that is very special about Austria, which is as its past as a European power in this cultural environment has generated a broad contribution of various forms of art, most notably among them music. So could you tell us about the famous Austrian composers and of course the world acknowledged Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra? Because I once read an article that says that the people of Vienna are so much concerned whenever the orchestra, the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra, will change its main conductor. They have also their say and their advice, and they would say, why did you pick X and not pick Y? And we think that X might be better than Y. All this stuff. This is something that you don't find in Boston Philharmonic or in London Philharmonic. You can only find it in Vienna, which makes it very special, right?
It is true. There is a grain absolute of truth what you're saying, because I mean it can happen that you grab a taxi in Vienna and then the taxi driver asks you about your opinion on the latest production in the opera, and then you discuss with him. And I think that's pretty unique.
Yes,
that you find this. Now, where does it come from? Again, we have to look back in history. There was, especially from the 15th century onwards, a very strong policy conducted by the then emperors because of our patchwork of ethnic groups, of languages. I mean, the empire had 9 different languages, official recognized languages, etc. To find a common denominator which everyone could go along with, and they invested heavily into whatever concerned music, and they established the first bodies, whether it's orchestras or others, and so on and so forth. So it became over the centuries, so to say, working like a machine, and of course there was no need anymore to subsidize it so heavily. But Vienna in particular was then established as a center of excellence, if I may say this in this a bit dreadful modern term, in terms of music. And whoever had to know or wanted to compete had to go to Vienna. Let's say Beethoven, who was not Austrian by birth, so he's from Bonn in Germany. And we know that he never liked Vienna in his life.
Really?
And yet he had to go there because he said, if I stay in Bonn, no one will know about me. So you have to go
Bonn
there.
was not famous except when it was the capital, after
Exactly.
World War II.
So this was a center where everyone who wanted to compete and show what.
And Mozart was not a resident of Vienna itself, right?
Mozart was not a resident of Vienna itself. He was from Salzburg, which was still a separate entity with the Archbishop of Salzburg during his time. And Mozart, of course, like Haydn, were at the time when the court stopped hiring musicians and composers. So they were the last ones, and went over to the time, bridged the time to the it was kind of a liberal art, and you had to compete and you had to perform in order to make also your living. But I mean, coming back to the composers you asked for, I mean, it's a long list. I don't know where to start with. But of course, I think, I mean, just to mention a few, one for me myself. I mean, I'm very, very much into classical music. Of the most Austrian composers is certainly Schubert. I think who touches the soul of my country in whatever, whether it's the lead, it's piano work, it's orchestra work. That's one of the most Austrian, I would say. But you have everything. You have Bruckner. Last year we had the jubilee of Anton Bruckner, one of the big composers of the 19th century that went far ahead of the time. I mean, if you listen to his symphonies, you think you are already at the time of Stravinsky, and came in much later.
Yes, that's why Bernstein was always very fond of him, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And
exactly.
he wanted always to make his work very more popular, right?
Right. But Vienna was also, up to the 20th century, a laboratory of trying out new things. Take the Schoenberg, who comes out of the Vienna circles, and who pushed permanently, so to say, in this case, the music to the edge, and at the research of finding something new and developing further. So there's it's a fascinating history.
And Strauss, of course, is like a popular music. I mean, it was in the late 19th century, and
exactly,
and people felt like it because this is, I think, what pushed Asmahan to give her song. Right?
You're very right. You're very right. So
the waltz, I mean, that's
absolutely.
Yes.
And this is something that goes throughout the centuries ever since. And we have again a jubilee this year with Strauss, and there was also in the New Year's concert, which is perhaps the most known concert, globally speaking, performed by Vienna Philharmonic on the 1st of January.
Yes, of course. And Schubert, I mean, your choice of Schubert is definitely very, very interesting, because Schubert has very, classical and very high upbringing music. When you feel it's a bit, not complicated, but it really touches your soul,
yes,
which makes him very, very, very special.
Yes,
right.
I think that everyone can find himself or herself,
part of himself in Schubert's music. Yes,
absolutely.
He was very much interested in the soul.
Yes,
to expose not soul music, but soul. I mean, his own soul.
Exactly.
his own soul to search for meanings of sadness or happiness.
Exactly.
I think this is what makes him very, very special, right?
Exactly.
But Mozart. I mean, of course, the use of Baroque music in Mozart put it sometimes away from the taste of the people. But his geniusity, I mean, is...
No, I mean, of course, Mozart and Haydn as the Vienna classic, so to say, because that was what we call in German the Wiener Classic, which is a period in music that has its own way of composing, of also performing. And if you study an instrument, you have to learn also on how to phrase it and so on and so forth. So that's a very, very special chapter in the time. And of course, both of them genius. Mozart is well known globally as well, and certainly influenced far into time, into the future.
Yes.
From the viewpoint.
I mean, you can never. I mean, the idea of, in such a very short time that his life, he has produced all these amount of productions. This makes him very unique. And so let's talk for a minute before we go to Egyptian-Austrian relations, the Vienna Philharmonic.
Yes.
Who's currently now the conductor?
Well,
this
is now I have to unveil that the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra doesn't have a permanent conductor since decades, contrary to the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra or others.
Although Karajan worked with you sometimes, right?
Pardon me?
Karajan worked sometimes in Vienna, right?
They invite conductors. Karajan was the chief conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic.
Yes, I know.
But of course had permanently also concerts.
He has a lot of recordings with Vienna Philharmonic.
Yes,
Bernstein was
especially in the last years of Karajan.
Yes, and Bernstein also worked with Vienna. And
it was one of his favorite orchestras.
Yes, definitely. That's why he did a lot of innovations with Bruckner.
Exactly. But I think you have the who is who of conductors conducting with the Vienna Philharmonic. All big conductors are permanently there. Currently, I know, although it's not the chief conductor of the Vienna Philharmonic, which they don't have, as I said before, but one of their favorite conductor is Riccardo Muti.
Yes.
And they also came to Egypt, by the way, in order to open officially the opera house in the new capital.
Yes.
It was the Vienna Philharmonic and Riccardo Muti.
You didn't tell me that.
That makes me very proud. And when you enter the opera house, you have two photographs there. One is of the Vienna Philharmonic, and then one of Riccardo Muti. And this is something which made me very proud when I entered the opera house.
Well, definitely, this is really very interesting when we talk about Vienna Philharmonic, because they say that once the Vienna Philharmonic was playing, and suddenly there was was a problem with electricity, and it was shut down, so they cannot see the maestro. So the lead violinist said, "Okay, gentlemen, let's continue," and they continued.
Yes.
So this was not bragging, but this was true, and this is a true information. I think you have read this
absolutely,
before. Yes.
absolutely.
So that's why they don't hire a permanent conductor. They just work on and
They don't
on.
need it. Probably.
They don't need it, for God's sake. Well,
Exactly.
before we leave, I mean, we have to talk about the one of the most important reasons that you are here, sir, in Cairo, which is to nurture the Egyptian-Austrian relations, and makes it very special. I mean, it's been always a friendly relation,
Very much.
whether this was in the 19th century or the 20th century. Vienna, as an empire during the 19th century, never had its own greed, if we may use the expression, in Egypt, but there has been always a friendly relation with the empire. And of course, in 1955 onwards, we had a very strong relations, whether this was with Austria, or the fact that it is also the site of the International Atomic Agency, which belongs to the United Nations, and of course the friendly relations that we had with Kurt Waldheim, whether he was the Secretary General of Vienna of the United Nations, or the nominal president of the country. So, what makes the relations so special, sir?
Well, let me just first and foremost confirm what you just said. We always had excellent relationship, starting in the 19th century, of course, because also members of the royal family traveled to Egypt frequently. We were in the 19th century already archaeologically present in Giza, so one of the longest-serving archaeological teams came here.
And Elizabeth came to Egypt, right?
She came as well, and also her husband came to Egypt, because we were one of the most interesting nations in the Suez Canal. Don't forget this, because for us, since we had at that time we were not landlocked, but we had ports at the Adriatic Sea. So for us this was a big gain.
And he attended the inauguration, right?
So
Franz Joseph and
if you
Elizabeth.
go to the Marriott Hotel in the Malik, you can find the paintings where they sit at table, and you see also the Emperor of Austria at that time and his wife. After World War One, you said right, from 55 on, but we opened our embassy already in 1948, so that was before the State Treaty. We are entirely new independence. Egypt was one of the first countries reopened an embassy, and ever since we are here. We have a very solid relationship. Why can I say this? Because you always have, of course, in different dossiers and sometimes different views on things, but you feel that the core relationship is so stable and so solid that it doesn't matter if you have sometimes a different view on an issue, and then you discuss it and you find a way out, and it's fine. But what carries you is this trust that we have. And in this regard, I think the relationship is unbroken and very, very solid up to now. Of course, we engage a lot economically with Egypt. We engage also in terms of companies that established fabrication in Egypt. We are in several fields. We are in the railway sector. We are in the packaging sector. We are in fruits and vegetables. We are again in railway with the production of turnouts and so on and so forth. We also start now very concretely programs of training Egyptians in Egypt with us, in order to bring in also the vocational training
programs that you have. Yes, this is very important.
That enables later on Egyptian citizens also either establish their own relationship or their own businesses, or they contribute and work with us in our companies, in our fabrics and the production sites here in Egypt. So it is actually a big success story so far.
So definitely you have an Egyptian community in Austria, right?
Yes.
Which is Egyptians who went to study in
Yes.
Vienna and stayed, whether
Yes.
this was in the 60s or 70s.
Yes.
Some of the Egyptians have started there from scratch, and now they're having their own businesses. They started selling. I mean, in the 70s it was common. Some of the students would go and sell newspapers in the middle of very cold weather. Yes, very cold weather. But these were stories of success. It's a peaceful community. They're never involved in crimes or whatever, or hostilities. They are definitely having very good reputation. Absolutely. I have a lot of friends whose families or brothers or sisters have been living in Austria for years now. So tell us about that.
This is what we would like to reinvigorate, because I mean, since you speak, I mean, they all came to our country in order to study. Of course, some came back with a diploma and a wife, because just recently had a gathering at my house with Austrian ladies who married Egyptians who came to Vienna to study, and then they followed them here to Egypt, and they came in the 50s and 60s. Very distinguished ladies. But of course, in the 90s, unfortunately, we lost a little bit in terms of numbers of students. And I believe very much in a students' exchange, because this is the future. And wherever you spend time studying, it stays ingrained in your mind. And
definitely. It develops a lot of...
in both ways.
A lot of scientific loyalties, if I may use
Correct.
the expression. Not political loyalties.
Exactly.
But you always say, my professor said so and
Exactly.
so. And this is what I feel, even with my short scholarships or fellowships over there abroad,
Exactly.
I always have this feeling.
But we lost in numbers because our universities started at a very late stage to teach also in English. This is a phenomenon we witnessed all over the Arab countries, so not just with Egypt. And I agree entirely with the Egyptian ambassador in Vienna that we have to reinvigorate this,
Yes,
to have more exchanges and to get more students back to Austria, but also to have students coming over to Egypt.
Definitely.
These are the real ambassadors of our countries.
Sir, we can go on talking forever about Austria and Austrian-Egyptian relations. So you have to promise us to come back again.
I will.
I know how busy you are, how you have a lot of things to do, but please give us a window so that you can come in with us.
With pleasure.
To have with us. We really, dear listeners, we have had with us a distinguished ambassador, His Excellency Georg Pöstinger, the ambassador of Austria to Cairo, with not hard talk, soft talk, and friendly talk that we had for the past hour. Stay tuned, Radio Cairo. My name is Dr. Amr Mabrouk. Dua Muhammad was at the control, and hope to see you the same time, same station next week. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.